Hello, I'm Sheryl McCarthy. Welcome to One to One. For decades, New York City's epic conflict between building expressways and parkways for cars and investing in mass transit has been blamed on one man, Robert Moses. As Parks Commissioner and the head of 10 other public agencies, Moses used his political power to build roads, bridges, parks, and beaches. But his preference for automobiles over mass transit helped create the traffic congestion that afflicts the city today. In her book, Movement: New York's Long War to Take Back Its Streets from the Car, Nicole Gelinas, journalist and senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, argues that Moses was not the only villain in this story. He was aided by generations of city officials, civic leaders, business people, journalists, and even members of the public in undermining mass transit. Many heroes have fought to prevent the city from becoming completely overwhelmed by cars, which is important, Gelinas says, since the future of mass transit and of the streets will determine the future of New York City. Welcome.
Good afternoon, Sheryl. Thanks for having me on today.
New York City is known for several things, particularly skyscrapers, the theater, Wall Street, and traffic. Too many cars. You argue that the city's love affair with cars, which started in the early 1900s, helped to move the city almost to the brink of irreversible urban decline. Tell me what you mean by that.
Right. So for much of the 20th century until the 1960s, New York's response to the advent of the automobile was the same as most other American cities, which is we're not going to try to fit the car into the city. We are going to redesign the city for the car. Now, if you go back and review what people were thinking at the time in the 1920s and the 1930s and the 1940s, where more and more people were buying cars, they wanted to get around in their own personal vehicle. This made sense in the minds of city officials, not just Moses, but elected officials at the state and local level as well, that we wanted to compete with the suburbs. And you could have a suburban lifestyle driving in your car from your single-family house to your place of work. A lot of people thought that was preferable to cramming into a subway, walking around on the crowded streets. And the city thought, well, if we don't give people the same lifestyle choice in the city, more people will just move out to the suburbs. The problem with that thinking, as became gradually apparent over the decades, is that people live in the city because they want to live in the city. They want to walk around, they want to be in denser apartment buildings, denser office buildings that allows them to agglomerate and have the cultural offerings, the high income job offerings that you were talking about. And so if you try to make the city into a suburb, you're just destroying that, literally paving over sidewalks, paving over dense, historic, landmark neighborhoods just so that people can drive through them rather than want to be in them.
And the problem was that if you built more roads in order to accommodate cars, you just got more cars.
Right, that's exactly what happened. So over and over from the 1930s through the mid-1960s, New York would build a road, an expressway or a parkway, or just widen one of the avenues in Manhattan. And city officials would say, aha, we've solved the problem, we have more road space. Immediately, that road would just fill up with more traffic, right, and you were back to your original problem. And by the late 1950s, early 1960s, people were saying, this is getting ridiculous. You would have to pave over all of Long Island and have a 60-lane Long Island Expressway in order to get the traffic that wants to come from Long Island through Queens and Brooklyn into the heart of the city. I mean, we just can't approach it in this way anymore.
And the impetus for this was something called, I'd never heard of before, the Regional Plan of New York and its Environs, which was put together by prominent residents, which probably meant they were quite wealthy, and citing traffic congestion. And they came up with this plan What were the main points of it?
Right. I'm glad you brought that up, Cheryl, because the regional plan, as you said, it was kind of the wise men of their day, people prominent in business. There was a former railroad executive on there, people prominent in civic life, the gentleman who designed the first zoning plan for the city to protect our light and air from skyscrapers. He was on there. This regional plan appointed to, and with philanthropic money, appointed to figure out what should the city look like over the next few decades in terms of the infrastructure, and also do we want people to live right alongside factories, or do we want zoning to put different uses into different neighborhoods? And so their main answer to the challenges of the growing city was, people want to be in cars, we need to build them more space. And so this was the plan, came out in the late 1920s, that had the maps of what became the Cross Bronx Expressway, what became the Belt Parkway out in Brooklyn and Queens, and what would have been the Lower Manhattan and the Mid-Manhattan Expressway. So this was kind of the blueprint that New York followed for the next 30 years. And the interesting thing about the regional plan is it had nothing to do with Moses. When the people were putting together the regional plan in the late 1920s, Moses was just building up his public position. He was kind of an ambitious young man. He was working on his first parkway on Long Island. He was working on Jones Beach, but he had no public reputation to speak of where you wouldn't go to him and say, Moses said we should do this, so that's what we'll do. These people came up with this plan independently of Moses.
And basically Moses was just implementing the plan.
Yes, and now, that may understate it a little bit in terms of Moses did have his passions. He was very proud, particularly of the housing projects that he built. There were certain things he was enthusiastic about. He was enthusiastic about what he called the slum clearance for housing. He was enthusiastic about the public parks. There are certainly things, for good or for ill, that you could say Moses did that. But the roads are honestly not one of them. If Robert Moses had not lived, or he had been born somewhere else, New York would have built largely the same road system, because that is what it laid out to do.
Yeah.
And the main complaint about Moses well into the late 50s was, he's not building these things quickly enough for us.
Okay. And some of the principles of the plan were, you build expressways to get people from one place to another quickly. You build parkways, which are much more scenic routes and will take people out to the beaches and I guess the subways. And you ban buses and trucks from the parkways. And it was best, another principle, it was best to build through underdeveloped areas, which created havoc in a lot of the lower income areas. So those were some of the principles. And as you said, it gave us things like the Triborough Bridge and the Cross Bronx Expressway, which tends to be the most vilified of some of those projects. Why was that?
Right. So when people think of Moses, they think of the Cross Bronx Expressway, which, again, the blueprint for this was built before Moses had a say over it. So if you think about the George Washington Bridge, this is a Port Authority of New York and New Jersey project, had nothing to do with Robert Moses. You built the George Washington Bridge on one side from New Jersey to Manhattan and the Bronx, and then you build further bridges, Throgs Neck, Whitestone Bridge to the east, and this is the sort of the beginnings of I-95. Once you built those two bridges, and nobody complained about building the bridges, no one ever says that George Washington Bridge destroyed neighborhoods. But once you built the bridges, you have to build a connection between the bridges. So this is something put together piece by piece, where this was that last piece of the interstate. And again, well into late 1950s, 1960s, New York Times, business community, conventional wisdom was saying, you have got to build that last piece.
And that was the Cross Bronx Expressway?
Right. People were certainly aware of the great human costs of thousands of people being evicted from their homes. And the conventional wisdom, not just Moses, but the mayor, the borough president, other elected and appointed officials, was, well, we have to keep building this thing out. You know, we can't think about the human cost. So this is not something where Moses alone was doing something that New York City did not want. Yeah. This was the choice that New York City made.
Do we know how many cars pass through New York City in the course of a day?
Let's see, if you think about cars coming into Manhattan alone is a little under 1 million. So that gives you an idea of the scope in the whole city.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so you had all of these building projects that were the result of the plan. But then you started to get, at some point, a critical mass of elected officials and powerful business and civic interests that were fought back against this kind of building. I was not aware until I read your book about the battle for to save Washington Square Park.
Villainization of Moses is a little bit of a myth. The canonization of Jane Jacobs is also a bit of a myth, and it is not to take away from her accomplishments. It's to say that this idea that one woman stopped Moses in his tracks and changed the face of New York City, it's not correct. That's not how successful activism in any area works. It took dozens, hundreds, even thousands of people, decades and decades, to put into place the strategy and tactics that would work in changing New York's approach from building more roads to rebuilding mass transit.
And it was a group of mothers.
Yes. So what happened
in Washington Square?
Exactly. So what happened in the 1950s? You had a woman named Shirley Hayes. She was a homemaker, 4 children in the village. She would be what we today call a gentrifier. The village was becoming less and less longshoremen, working class people moving out to the suburbs. In were coming young single people who liked the village's interesting vibe, gay people starting to come and live in the village, and
artists.
Right, and families that just kind of wanted a more bohemian lifestyle than the suburbs. So Shirley Hayes, raising her 4 kids, her husband was an ad executive, sitting in Washington Square Park one day. Now, there was a road running through Washington Square Park. There were buses going through the park, and she saw this New York Times article, Robert Moses is going to widen the road through the park. He's going to sink the road and make it essentially into a 4-lane highway, because they were doing urban renewal south of the park. NYU was building all these buildings, including staff apartment buildings. They wanted that thoroughfare going through the park to be widened to account for this new housing. So Shirley Hayes said, you know, we really don't want a wider road through the park. Our kids play in the park. She understood that earlier than most people, even though she wasn't an expert, if you build a road, you're just going to attract more traffic. We don't want that. And so she got together with these other homemakers, business people in the village, went to the borough president and went to the mayor. They had 30,000 petition signatures, which was a third of the village's population, and said, you know what, not only do we not want a wider road, but we just want to get rid of the road that's there altogether. We want this to be a park. And this took 13 years, so she had to be very persistent. The lesson that she learned that other activists, including Jane Jacobs, later took away from this was, in order to beat Moses, you don't go after Moses. You don't write Moses letters and beg him to not do this. You go after the elected officials who ultimately control Moses. So she put enough pressure on the mayor, on the borough president, on Carmine DeSapio, the district leader, that they were worried about their votes, and they were the ones who stopped the project.
So fortunately now we don't have a highway through Washington Square Park.
Yes, we don't have the road through Washington Square Park, and because Jane Jacobs was living in the village through this battle, she was watching this battle, she volunteered, and not at a leadership level, but she was out getting petitions signed in the Shirley Hayes coalition. She put these lessons to use a decade over in killing the much bigger Lower Manhattan Expressway. If she hadn't seen the example of Shirley Hayes and others, she could not have successfully done what she did. So this wasn't just one intellectual, writing for Architectural Forum who said, aha, I can get rid of Moses. This was a large-scale, long-term effort.
Right. Later victories, Westway, I remember, when I was a younger reporter, it was all about Westway, and it was about Westway for many, many years before it was finally killed off.
Right, and Westway is a great example of how you cannot lay this at the feet of Moses. Moses was long gone, and yet the city and the state continued to want to build a highway underneath Manhattan.
Yeah.
They did not stop wanting to build highways even after Moses was gone and dead by the mid-1980s.
Right through the city. You write that the only real buffer against cars in the city is mass transit.
Yes, 3/4 of people on an average day use mass transit to get into Manhattan, to work, to do their errands, to see family and friends. They do not drive motor vehicles into Manhattan. And that's true for the most part of other parts of the city, although it is more difficult to get from, say, South Brooklyn to Staten Island. I mean, once you get away from the Manhattan core, you have issues with us having an inefficient, inadequate mass transit system. But without the mass transit system that we have, with all of these people on the road fighting for road space, you couldn't do things like bike lanes, you couldn't do things like bus lanes, you couldn't do things like pedestrian plazas. Unless you've got millions of people underground, you have a real problem with trying to fit people above ground. So even some people watching, understandably, many people rely on cars for many different reasons. But if you rely on your car and say, I never take the subway, so why should I care? You should care, because if other people didn't take the subway, you would be in a lot more traffic above ground.
Right. Now, there have been a number of recent efforts to curb automobile use in the city. You talk about bicycles, that's one, and certainly the city in recent years, I don't know who started it, was it Bloomberg, the creation of bicycle lanes. How is that going?
Well, yes, so starting right around the turn of the millennium, Bloomberg, the Bloomberg administration empowered Jeanette Sadiq-Khan, his transportation commissioner, to start thinking about, now that we have spent 30 years rebuilding the subways. There was a big effort to find taxpayer funding for the subways starting in the 1980s, get graffiti off the subways, replace old failing subway cars with
reduce
new cars.
the crime in the subways.
Right. So it was only because they had done all those things that finally by 2007, 2008 or so, there was some breathing space for Bloomberg to say, because remember, Bloomberg had a Bloomberg LP office in London. He was traveling the world, seeing what are other cities doing. He saw in London, they're doing bike lanes, they're making more room for pedestrians. At the same time, New York, growing toward a record population, we just couldn't fit any more people in the subway. I mean, those few stops going from Brooklyn into Manhattan were just packed beyond capacity. The 456 Lexington Avenue line from Wall Street to Midtown to the Upper East Side, you just couldn't fit another person on the subway. So you had to think, we need to get some of these people from the subways onto bicycles. We need to get more people out of cars onto bicycles. And we've got 400,000 people a day walking through Times Square. We have got to give them more space. They just will not fit in this space. So then we started giving over some of this surface space to other uses, people who were not sitting in a car, but on bicycle and on foot.
Of course, the bicycles have created their own problems.
Yes. As with many things in New York City, we tend to do the right thing the wrong way. You can go to many cities around the world, whether it's Copenhagen, Paris, London. People on bicycles follow the law, they stop at the red light, they respect the pedestrians. We still have a big problem with that, and it is understandable, although cars and trucks are responsible for 99% of traffic crashes. When you are a pedestrian, to see an e-bike coming the wrong way on the sidewalk, to be looking out for the cars and trucks, and then have an e-bike coming along out of the corner of your eye, unless and until we do a better job of getting people to act in a more civic, respectful fashion, it is hard, and understandably, pedestrians feel like the bicyclists are their enemy.
But how can you police cops who are either walking or who are driving police cars? You can't follow a bike. You can't weave in the traffic the way bikes do. You can't run after and catch a bike. So
yes,
how do you control?
And particularly with the commercial e-bike, over the past few years, particularly since the pandemic began 4.5 years ago, you have people on e-bikes who are in a hurry to make these deliveries because they are paid by the delivery. The city really ought to be going not to the people on the bikes, but to the companies, to Uber Eats, Grubhub, DoorDash, the apps and the restaurants, and saying, this bike should be owned by the company, it should be insured, it should have an identifiable license plate on it, just like a commercial vehicle. So we have failed to differentiate between people using bikes for a commercial purpose and people using them as their own personal way of getting around, and that has harmed public support for cycling.
Yeah.
And, it doesn't have to be that way.
Right. Now back to mass transit. There's been a decline in subway use. It started during COVID, when people weren't coming into the city, weren't using the subways, working from home, and the subways have not recovered. But cars have increased, correct?
Yes, it's a unfortunate part of our COVID recovery that car use into Manhattan, but not only into Manhattan, is well above pre-pandemic levels. You're 101 to 110% of pre-pandemic car use, but subway ridership is only 3/4 or so of pre-pandemic ridership. So we are far behind London, Paris, other cities, Tokyo, cities that are back up to 100% or more of pre-pandemic transit ridership. And that's for a couple of reasons. One is people still working at home, not all the time, but many people still come into the office only 2 or 3 days a week instead of 5 days a week. So they're not on the subway. But also the crime and disorder that started to take off in March of 2020. We used to have 1 or 2 homicides on the subway every year. That was true from the mid-90s up until 2019. Now we're having 10 homicides on the subway a year. We've had 41 homicides in 4 years, most of them random attacks. So it is understandable that for some people with a choice, do I want to get on the subway today or not, are saying, I don't really want to. So
yeah.
we learned this lesson before. As you mentioned, part of our building up the city from the 1970s decline was getting crime off of the subway,
right,
starting in 1990. Now that we've lost sight of that, it is uncomfortable sometimes.
We got to get the crime off again. In the 1990s, there was a big push by bicyclists for bicycle lanes.
The main bicycle advocacy group was Transportation Alternatives.
Okay.
People may remember the critical mass rides through Manhattan, which was separate from Transportation Alternatives.
Okay. And Well, apparently they won the fight ultimately.
Yes, if you think about transportation alternatives, they were founded by just a few people who wanted to bicycle to work in the early 1970s, so they're 50 years old now. This was, just like with the highway fights, this was decades worth of activism for bike lanes and bike share that finally paid off in the early 2000s when Mayor Bloomberg picked up this cause.
But critical mass had staged these huge protests, correct?
Yes,
bike
critical
rides.
mass, people who have lived in New York City for a reasonably long time may remember sort of these thousands of people riding through Manhattan on their bikes. I think it was Friday nights, sort of just trying to redefine the street space, that these streets are not just for motor vehicles, they are for bicyclists as well. And it's an interesting way of thinking about it, because people would see all these bicyclists and say, well, they're getting in the way, but the cars are also getting in the way. We just don't think of cars as getting in the way. We sort of think of the streets as belonging to the cars.
What other things do you think to try to curtail the traffic and to try to get more people back onto the subway?
We need to think more about borough-to-borough mass transit. So the mass transit system was built starting in the mid-1800s, and then, of course, building the first subways in the early 1900s, for the most part, to bring people into Manhattan in the morning and send them wherever else they went at the end of the day, with more people living in Queens and working in Brooklyn, living in Connecticut and working in Manhattan, living in Manhattan and working in New Jersey. We need to think of one regional transportation system so that it is just as easy to get from the Bronx to Brooklyn on transit. If you do Google Map trips of a lot of these trips, it is easier and faster to get there by private car than it is on transit. So that's something to think about for a 21st century transit system.
Sounds really expensive.
Everything in New York is expensive.
Everything is expensive. Well, it's a long, exhaustive, though not exhausting, look at the history of this tension between cars and mass transit in New York City. And I learned a lot from it, and I appreciate your working on 5 years and
likewise, yes.
and giving it to us. I'm afraid we're out of time. I'd like to thank Nicole Gelinas, Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute and author of Movement, New York's Long War to Take Back Its Streets from the Car, for joining me today. To learn about our upcoming shows, you can follow us on Instagram at 1-to-1 CUNY TV. And you can now watch the show on the go by downloading the CUNY TV app. For the City University of New York and 1-to-1, I'm Sheryl McCarthy.